Well, hello there, studio teacher friends. Welcome to the Beyond Measure podcast with me, Christina Whitlock. I am your host, as well as your self appointed anytime piano teacher friend. Today's episode features a conversation I am so excited to share with you. If you have been out of the loop, this summer I am hosting actual conversations here on the podcast with some of my teacher friends. Actually, I am hosting double conversations with each of my guests, one chat that you'll hear here in just 1 minute on the podcast, and a second conversation that is being posted to the Patreon community. If you want more from today's discussion, Patreon membership is very affordable. Joining the Patreon community helps support the many moving parts behind this podcast. So, to those of you who are already members of the Patreon, thank you for helping me keep the lights on over here at Beyond Measure Podcast. Everyone else, I'd strongly encourage you to check it out at ChristinaWhitlock.com/Patreon. That's ChristinaWhitlock.com/Patreon. Thanks in advance for all of your support. So let's move on now, shall we? I've got a great guest joining me today. You are listening to the Summertime Conversation series here on the Beyond Measure podcast. Okay, you guys, this is not a drill. Today marks the end of our Summertime Conversation series, and it is so good. Now, to be fair, I have loved every single conversation I have featured this summer. I am grateful for all the wisdom and the laughter that has been shared here these past 10 weeks. And today is no different. Today's conversation features the incomparable Vanessa Cornett. Now, it's possible some of you don't know Vanessa Cornett, which brings me so much joy to introduce you. I know Vanessa as one of my can't-miss presenters at national conferences, and of course, the author of one of my must-read books for teachers called The Mindful Musician. If you've not read The Mindful Musician, please do yourself a favor and order that one pronto. It is so good. I talked about it last summer during my summer bookshelf tour. You can check that out in episode 132. And Vanessa and I are discussing it further in this week's supersized bonus Patreon conversation. Simply head to ChristinaWhitlock.com/Patreon for access to that chat and so much more. The best thing about Vanessa Cornett is the way she makes us think. And today's podcast is no exception. So prepare yourself for some top-notch brain puzzles because, ready or not, here they come. Enjoy, my friends. Welcome, Vanessa. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super happy to be here.
So my plan for today was to revisit episode 98, in which I propose that our ego has quite a bit to do with why we musician types seem to find ourselves in these seasons of overcommitment, or maybe a lifelong season of overcommitment. But there's, of course, lots of things that feed into this tendency we have to get ourselves involved in lots of things. I know for me, something just finally snapped when I turned 40, and I realized that there just was not any title or bragging right or anything else that was worth running myself ragged over. So today, you are here to help me reflect on the idea and the importance of doing nothing. So before we tackle that, though, do you have any thoughts, any personal theories that you would like to share about why musicians in particular seem to be so prone to overcommitting?
Yeah, it's a $1 million question. And I guess I would start by saying that I think the ego gets a bad rap.
Hmm.
I think, I mean, if we look at what ego originally meant, it originally meant a person's sense of self, like a
Mm.
sense of personal identity. Ego is the self that is I and not we. Okay, so somewhere in our culture that got bent. So now ego means a person's sense of self importance. Okay, fine. But if we dial that back and think that we do have to have a personal identity, we do have to have an idea of who I am, especially as
Mm.
musicians, because we're putting ourselves out there, then we can sort of think a little bit differently about ego because in the arts, we have to have a strong ego. I mean, we're selling our work, we're selling ourselves, we're putting a piece of ourselves out there every time we perform. So I guess I would just start by saying, hey, there's nothing wrong with ego. I think what's hard is that we are stretched so thin in a society that doesn't, it's not that our society doesn't value the arts. Our society certainly consumes the arts, but our culture certainly doesn't compensate artists and musicians based on talent or hard work. So I think it's kind of a perfect storm.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, musicians need a strong ego.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, our culture makes us work hard in order to do what we love and still pay the rent. And we're also, the third piece is we're navigating a society where hustling and establishing a brand is top priority. So to work against ego is like swimming upstream against
Mm-hmm.
cultural values. What helps me is to peel the layers away from how I'm feeling by asking myself, why? So
Mm-hmm.
let's go to your original point. It feels good to be recognized and it feels good to be praised. And I would ask myself, why? And then I might say something like, well, it makes me feel appreciated. And then I would say, well, but Vanessa, why is that important? And then I might say, well, it makes me feel loved, or it makes me feel, and you just sort of get down to what is the core need we have. And sometimes it's to be respected or to be seen or to be heard or to, I don't know. That's what helps me.
Mm. That is all so good. We could just end the interview right there and people would walk away going, oh my goodness. But we have more. That's really exciting. Yeah, I think for me, when I recorded this original episode, I was in a season where I knew something had to go in my life. And what ended up going was my adjunct collegiate faculty position. And I think what has prompted me on this whole ego journey with that specific decision was that as I peeled back the layers as to why I was not willing to give it up, was because at the end of the day, I enjoyed having a university title. I loved my job and I loved the school. I loved my students. I loved the work. So this is not a burning remark, but it is just the truth of, okay, is this title to me worth enough for all of this work that is not being financially compensated in the way that I need it to be? And that made it really clear where I was able to say no, because anyone who knows anything knows that that title basically doesn't mean anything. So it was a whole.
It's a great point. What is a title? Why would we want a title? Why would we want to seek a title? And usually that boils down to how others perceive us. What if there was no title? You know, what if your title was nobody, comma, do you know what I mean? Or
Yes.
what if you got accepted into an Ivy League school, but you couldn't put that on your resume? Would you still go? Do you know what I mean? I
Mm-hmm.
think we're very concerned about how other people see us. And I think you mentioned turning 40. I think age has a lot to do with growing into yourself and knowing what you need and caring a little less about how you appear to other people. So I
Sure.
say brava to you.
One of the reasons I wanted to have you on to talk about this specific topic was you gave this incredible session last summer at NCKP. It was called A Session About Nothing. And I know that raised a lot of eyebrows and everyone was curious, but I thought, and I was right, that I had it figured out from the get go. I was hoping for two things from that session about nothing. I was hoping you were going to have Seinfeld references, and I was hoping that you were going to talk about kicking these obsessions with productivity out the window. And I was right on both accounts. So tell me about the impetus behind that presentation.
Yeah, that presentation was many years in the making, I think. And I always submit a proposal to a conference because my university will not pay me travel funding unless I'm actually presenting. So
Mhm.
if I want to go to NCKP, I can't get paid to go unless I'm presenting. Well, that summer, it just so happened that I had already been invited to give a TEDx talk on my trip to Turkey. So I
Mhm.
knew I was going and I knew I was getting paid. So that was the first and only session proposal I submitted where it was absolutely the session I wanted to give. Not the
Mhm.
session I knew people would like, not the session that would sound good as they were debating what proposals to select. And that's just something that had been turning around in my brain for a very long time. And I would say it was sparked by two major sides of my life. One is my teaching side, and some courses that I had taught at St. Thomas to a group of high achieving honors students. One was called Art and Music as Contemplative Experiences. And there
Mhm.
were a couple other courses. And in that course, we did a lot of looking at negative space, like looking differently at art and hearing differently when we listen to music, listening to the gaps in between phrases and stuff like that. And so that got me thinking. And then I love to read. I read a whole stack of books over a course of a couple years. And there's a book by Jenny Odell, and it's called How to Do Nothing. Jenny is a former art faculty at Stanford, and she's just a beautiful writer. And I love that book. And I read a book, Rest is Resistance by Tricia Hersey. And I read a book, All the Gold Stars, something about ambition and why we strive. I read Emergent Strategy from Adrienne Marie Brown. So I just had all of these ideas bouncing around. And then it just came to, what is the session that I want to give?
Yeah.
And I thought only a fool will accept this proposal.
Ta-da!
Ta-da! And they were not fools. They were very wise. And I was
Mhm.
really happy to be able to give that.
That is so fun to hear that backstory. That's always actually my top advice for teachers when they ask me about writing proposals is I tell them to stop worrying about what they think is going to get accepted and what everybody wants to hear, all the things you mentioned, and write what you know and what you're passionate about. I just think that comes out. Now, I'm generally not trying to get funding for my trip, so maybe I'm a little bit more emboldened to just submit what I want. But it was such a great session. The energy in the room was fantastic. And I always tell teachers if Vanessa Cornett is on the program, you go to her session. You just do. You are a not miss presenter for me. I think when I think about this specific presentation for you, what wows me is that as you are preparing these types of talks, as you mentioned, you have to spend all of this time with the material yourself. And it's very convicting for yourself as you're working through it. It's like I've had pastors tell me that it's difficult to live with the convictions of next Sunday's message because they have to weigh on them all week before they speak on it on Sunday morning. And I do think that presenting at conferences is kind of the same thing. So, was it difficult to have these ideas specifically circling around your head for all those weeks and months leading up to NCKP?
Are you asking, was it difficult to have nothing in my head?
Well,
No.
no, only I think I'm curious just because, as I'm sure we'll talk about more today, there is sort of this pressure to rest more in today's culture. This is a big sticking point for me and something I get really frustrated with in the realm of self-care, quote, and all of those things. And so I feel like as someone who has a lot to do, which you do, it was probably sort of nagging to also know, oh, I should be resting, or oh, rest is important. And I don't know, maybe that wasn't the case at all.
Yeah, this is the type of thing I think about all the time. I like mind puzzles. I like a
Mhm.
good paradox or a good Zen koan or something that baffles the brain, right? So I like sort of turning around these ideas in my mind of what does nothing mean and what if we celebrated nothing
Yeah.
and if one of the definitions of nothing is something of no interest, value, or consequence, then what does that mean? And
Mhm.
honestly, I had an ulterior motive, and that was I wanted to start a revolution. I wanted musicians to say, no, I don't abide by these cultural expectations anymore. I don't want to be a brand, maybe, or I don't want to prove my self worth through overachieving, or I don't know. There's a great quote by Henry David Thoreau that I love in his civil disobedience essay. He wrote, "Let your life be a counter friction to stop the machine." And I kind of just,
Ooh.
I wanted to be a counter friction just for that one conference session. So,
Yeah. Wow. During your session, I jotted down like a list of bullet points that you gave, like citing ways that we have been, quote, brainwashed in our society. So some of these norms that you're referring to that we're building this resistance against, right? So like things like when we are doing nothing, we could be doing something more important and all of those types of things. Like, can we hang out with some of those thoughts for a few moments?
but once you realize you've been brainwashed, it's sort of
Mhm.
easy to look back and see what you've been conditioned to believe. Things like we should always be productive, or at the very least, we should always look busy, right?
Mhm.
We can't sit at the airport gate and just stare at the wall. We have to be on our phones, or we have to be reading a book, or we have to look busy. We have something to prove to other people.
Mhm.
One of my favorite brainwashings is we can rest, but only so we can return and be more productive later.
Exactly.
We're
Exactly.
brainwashed to believe exhaustion is normal, burnout is
Mhm.
normal, the machine level pace of our society is normal. I could go on and on. We've been brainwashed a lot. And you mentioned self care earlier. I think we've been brainwashed to believe that self care is our responsibility in a culture that makes us feel exhausted and burned out. So, yeah, the list goes on and on.
I think you Googled something like, why is my self care not working or something? And the results were really startling.
The results were startling. I Googled, yeah, why is my self-care not working? And I looked at all of these sort of self-help pop culture sites that are people go to. And every answer I found was an example of victim blaming. You have
Hmm.
not done this. You have not figured this out. You are not. And I just thought, oh my gosh, it's
Yes.
just really, really crazy. Yeah,
Yeah. I have a total axe to grind with this self care thing because it is an industry, first of all, that has
100%.
been built around this idea of self care. And it's one more thing for us, particularly women, to feel guilty about not doing. I don't need another thing to feel guilty about not doing, but now I feel like I need to be making more time for all of these things that are going to make me a more productive, better, happier person. And oh, it's so impossible to keep up on. So, how do we go about prioritizing not doing things without making it feel like something we have to do?
You are really good at asking what I call $1 million questions that could be the question that an entire book answers. And it's a highly personal question because I
Hmm.
think at the core of what you're asking is how can I feel okay about doing what I need to do for my own well being? And
Hmm.
that's deep. That's an individual journey. And a lot of it has to do with age, and a lot of it has to do with privilege and how
Hmm.
much we are able to do. I think, speaking of my revolution, I think we should start to change how we think about self care. And people like you are clearly already doing that, thinking that maybe self care isn't as much our responsibility since we didn't create the corporate culture that is like driving us at this machine pace or driving us to burnout. The idea that self care can be victim blaming. I think the hard part is changing the culture. But I think what helps me is to realize that we will never get there. Like we
Hmm.
have this idea of life balance or self-care or making time, and the goals are wonderful, something to aim for, but we will never get there. We will
Hmm.
never get our ducks in a row. I have no ducks. I have raccoons, and they are definitely not in a row. Um, so and the other thing to think of is you're right. Sometimes self care makes it feel like, oh, there's one more thing on my to do list. But some of us like to do lists. Like I have this habit app that always pops up with this message telling me to drink water. And
Hmm.
I think, oh, and then I drink water and I feel like I get a little gold star and I feel really good about myself. There's nothing wrong with that. I happen to be somebody who likes sort of having something easy, some low hanging fruit to sort of tick off my to do list. And then I think, oh, look, I drank water today. I'm still alive. And that's how it works for
Hmm.
me.
Yeah. There's so much empowerment with what you just said. I appreciate it so much. I always think back to this conversation that I had with some colleagues in undergrad, where I had this friend that was a vocal major and her roommate was a piano major in my studio. And I was talking to the vocal major, and she had said, my roommate thinks it's bad to watch TV. Like, she just thinks it's bad. Like, it's such a waste of time. So if she comes home and I'm watching TV, like, I feel guilty. And I have to confess that at that point in my life, in my head, I was like, it is a waste of time. Why would you be sitting around watching TV? But it sparked something in me, like this inner debate of, oh, what does it mean to waste time? And why do I feel like that's just such an awful thing? And it's, hello, piano performance major. That's why you feel like you can't waste time. But when I hear you talk about these things, it takes me back to like my 20-year-old self and that conversation. And I guess I have been hashing out these questions ever since then. So,
Well, and the idea that if something is a waste of time, the unspoken piece of that is there is something more important you should be doing.
right.
And that is entirely cultural. And I've
Mhm.
traveled a lot and I've traveled outside of our culture. And I lived in Turkey for 5 months where it takes literally 1 hour to go shopping because you have to stop and you have to talk to people and they have to show you all of the bread they baked and then they have to tell you gossip about other things and then they have to give you coffee and then you have to sit down, you have to drink the coffee. And this idea of time, that is what's important. It's not I'm wasting time. I could be doing something else. It's let's enjoy each other right now and get to know each other right now. So I totally hear what you're saying. And I
Mhm.
appreciate that you're able to pull back and say, well, that was ridiculous.
Well, and I think I've heard you share a story that like you would be in the middle of teaching a lesson and a colleague would come by with coffee, right? When you were living in
Every
Turkey.
day,
Yeah.
every day. And they'd come in with a tray of Turkish coffee for me, for them, for my student, and the lesson would come to a grinding halt and everyone would sit and drink coffee. And if that happened at the University of St. Thomas today, I'd be like, no, we only have 60 minutes and we got to do the scales and we got to play the Brahms. But it wasn't that culture. It was right now, let's drink coffee and let's make eye contact and let's connect. And it was actually amazing. And I did something. The other thing they would do is bring a box of chocolate by my studio. And so I now keep a box of chocolate in my desk at my studio. And I let everyone know you can interrupt me at any time, come and sit down and have a piece of chocolate. And some of my colleagues do take me up on that. They'll just knock and
Oh.
say, I need chocolate. And they'll just sit down and I will stop what I'm doing. I'll stop with the email draft. I'll stop with the whatever I'm doing. And it feels really good, actually.
Yeah. But I don't know. Like I'm having a response to imagining myself doing that. So it shows how strong this is built into us. And I'm someone who values connection with other people over all things. I mean, this is why I'm a teacher, right? That connection, human to human, is so important to me. But it's like, there is work to be done.
That's right.
So, for fun, I did pull out my notes from your NCKP session that we're talking about today. And so I jotted down a few things. I'm wondering if you want to do like a lightning round through some of my notes.
I'm up for anything.
Okay. So, first of all, the first thing is I wrote in big, bold letters, what about our unresumed self? We kind of touched on this at the very start of the episode, but what about our unresumed self?
Yeah. That hits me deeply. And I think the self that we don't document for public
Mhm.
consumption is probably closer to our true, genuine self.
Mhm.
Okay, think of a baby. A baby can gurgle and spit up and coo and wriggle, and everything that baby does is perfect. And people ooh and ah and say, oh my gosh, this baby, oh, this baby's amazing. But we don't do that to people when they grow up. Like, I don't drink coffee and somebody goes, oh, she's amazing. Isn't she cute? She's just so precious. Because a baby just has to be itself
Mhm.
to feel loved and to feel recognized. What if we were the same way? What if we didn't
Mhm.
have to document our accomplishments? I often think about my unresumed self and what if I were to celebrate all the things that aren't on my CV?
Mhm. That hit me again. I know why I wrote it down the first time. And so this gets into the idea of negative space. But what if we celebrated the nothings in between the somethings? Hmm.
If we celebrated the perceived nothings that are the
Mm-hmm.
spaces in between the perceived somethings, I think we would turn our perspective of what is important on its head. What would it be like to live in a society where the spaces in between were more important than the important things? What would it be like to live in a society where standing quietly and marveling at the beauty of an oak tree was valued more highly than turning a quarterly profit or churning out a grant proposal? I think when we start to look at the gaps in between things, we start to get a glimpse of an alternate reality that could be our reality.
That's really beautiful. You gave us some great quotes earlier, but I wrote down one you had quoted by Wendell Berry, that I have thrown away my lantern and I can see the dark. I thought
I
that was
love
so good.
Wendell Berry.
I do
He
too.
is probably my favorite poet. He's at least in the top five. That quote reminds me of a Chinese proverb that goes something like, my barn having burned down, I can see the moon.
Mm,
It's just another way of flipping reality or perceived reality on its head and thinking, what if there's a different way to see what it is I'm experiencing right now?
right. Very similarly, you shared a quote by Gordon Hempton, who said, silence is not the absence of something, but the presence of everything. Which, again, I kind of just sit and think about that one all the time because it's true. It's everything in existence all at once. It's
It
not
is,
nothing.
and those are exactly the type of mind puzzles I like because vibrations are all around us, right? Whether we hear them or not. So to me, I mean, he's an acoustic ecologist, I think, which I don't even know what that means. So I know that he deals with acoustics in general, but I think it must be the aural equivalent of white light, light that contains all the colors of the spectrum. So what if silence wasn't nothing but everything? What if when we taught students what a rest was, it wasn't nothing? It was just a very subtle everything. Maybe that's too deep for a 6-year-old. I don't know, but it's just a thought to put out there.
I'm going to try it this week. I'm just kidding. I can't imagine the looks I'm going to get. But maybe some of my adults can get it. They'll probably think that's pretty cool. So, along with acoustic ecologists, what about Pauline Oliveros, who wrote this book on sonic meditations? Or is it a book? Is it a recording? I don't know. I just wrote it down.
It is a series of compositions, but they're
Oh, okay.
not notated. She published Sonic Meditations, I think, in the early 70s, like 1974 or something. And every page is a new piece, but it's instructions on what to do. So one of the Sonic Meditations is listen to a sound until you no longer recognize it. So it's, again, these are sort of mind puzzles, but she sort of approached music at the intersection of mindfulness and experience in music. Another sonic meditation that I love goes like this. She says, take a walk at night, walk so silently the bottoms of your feet become ears.
Oh, wow.
And these are compositions, right? These are
Yeah.
very avant-garde things that you can do as a group of musicians or just solo. So yeah, I love her.
I'm going to have to take a deep dive there because I'm a big John Cage fan. I love his thoughts on silence, not just the 433 that everybody knows. I just really like his philosophy on what is music, what is not. And it sounds like she's someone I definitely need to go take a deep dive on. So thanks for that.
Sure.
So I'll tell you what, we are going to have more of a conversation for my Patreon members here in a few minutes. But before we do that, why don't you tell my podcast listeners what you're up to these days and where they can find you, whether that's online or elsewhere?
What am I up to? I am working with my collaborator in Turkey. We collected a lot of good research data when I was there. So we are working on some additional publications about that, having to do with the effects of a mental skills seminar on conservatory students, whether it helped their performance anxiety, their sense of self-efficacy. So we're looking at that data. I'm looking at cultural differences and how we measure and talk about music performance anxiety. I just think that's really interesting.
Well, not only is it interesting, it's really valuable work that you're doing. And I think that's something that I think in all of your work that I admire is that you balance this like, oh, this is just cool to think about. These are great mental deep dives, but also, oh, this has real potential for change in a lasting, impactful way. And I just really admire all of the energy you put towards these very important topics. So
Thank
thank you
you.
for
I
that.
appreciate that very much. It is definitely a privilege when what you love to do and think about turns into something that's actually helpful. Because certainly I've had things that aren't helpful at all, but I do enjoy sort of thinking of things from a broader perspective. So, um,
And the things you enjoy that don't turn into anything are still worth something, right?
of course, because they're not nothing.
Look at us go. I'm learning, Vanessa. You are helping me.
Yay.
My friends are really going to love hanging out with me this afternoon. Oh, I'll tell you what. Tell me something. It's my fun closing question for the summer. Tell me something you love beyond measure, Vanessa. No serious answers allowed.
I love a good Alsatian Pinot Gris. I
Mm,
love black licorice. I love
really? Ooh,
good
polarizing.
funk from the 70s. Give me some Commodore's Brick House. Those are some of my favorite things.
Black licorice. I don't know.
Yum,
That's a
yum,
tough one.
yum. I hate cilantro, so I have this theory that cilantro haters probably gravitate to black licorice. I don't know. Hasn't
Oh,
been tested in the lab.
that's a great theory, though. We should mention that I wouldn't call it an unresumed something, but you hold like actual wine certifications. Am I right about that?
I do, I do. And that's a great example of a hobby that I decided needed a credential to go with it just because that's the type of type A personality I am. But yes, I do have 3 wine certifications, which I don't use except at parties to impress people. So, yes.
Well, as you're impressing people with your wine certifications, you're probably really good at giving a toast, right? Do you mind closing us out with a toast to the profession today?
I would love to offer a toast. Yes, let us raise our glass to nothing. Just make sure there is not nothing in your glass.
Hey.
But I hereby toast nothing to the idea of being instead of doing, or maybe to be a human being instead of a human doing. May we celebrate the quiet spaces in between other things. Here, here.
Here, here, indeed. Well, thank you so much, Vanessa. So, I mentioned that we're going to chat over in the Patreon community, and you are in a kind of a unique position here because you already have your own episode of this podcast that you weren't on, that I was talking about The Mindful Musician, your book that I love. And so, we're going to take a deep dive into some of those ideas for Patreon community members. So, I hope everyone will check that out. But for now, I will just thank you with all of my heart for today's oh so fun and meaningful conversation.
Thank you for having me. It has been a real pleasure.
That's a wrap on this episode, friends. But remember, there is more where that came from. Head to christinawhitlock.com/Patreon to learn more about how you can get access to all kinds of bonus goodies for just a few dollars this summer. I am convinced the Patreon community is pretty much the most affordable professional development on the internet. Pay special attention to the new offering called What Should I Teach Next? Because it's really good, if I do say so myself. One more favor to ask of you today. If you love this show, will you please take a moment and share it with other teacher friends? I know there are more teachers out there who need an anytime piano teacher friend in their lives, and I am ready and willing to do the job. Thanks in advance, my friends. That'll do it for today. onward and upward toward making the world a more musical place.